The Atlantic lay vast and somber in November of 1944, a restless expanse of frigid water that consumed the horizon. The Liberty ship sliced through it with the weary, resolute groan of metal, transporting not soldiers any longer, but captives, hundreds of German women salvaged from the ruin of a collapsing Reich. Some had served as auxiliary nurses, others as typists, drivers, or clerks, all swept up in the whirlwind of their nation's retreat. They had embarked in profound silence, guided under the watchful eyes of armed American sentinels. Their minds were a fog of apprehension and ingrained propaganda. They had been instructed that America was a land of violent mobs, of gnawing hunger, and of unyielding cruelty. This sea journey was to be the commencement of their retribution. The initial astonishment arrived almost instantly. In the lower deck refectory, metallic platters clattered onto long wooden tables. They were laden not with watery gruel or meager dark bread, but with steaming broth, rich with legumes and vegetables, accompanied by chunks of bread so pale and yielding they appeared unreal. A young woman, assisting with the Red Cross, scarcely 20 years of age, regarded her portion as if it were a deception. She murmured to her companion that it smelled like provisions meant for officers, not for prisoners. A United States cook, wiping his hands on his apron, merely offered a shrug. "Eat up, there's more than enough to go around." The women exchanged bewildered glances. They were not suffering deprivation, they were being nourished. Day after day, the ocean heaved around them, yet their apprehension began to transform, supplanted by a subtler disquiet, the dread of having been mistaken. For years, they had been told that Americans would treat them like beasts. Instead, the guards on deck largely paid them no mind, puffing on cigarettes and gazing into the mist. Some even extended small gestures of consideration, pointing out stellar formations in the night sky or passing a flask of coffee with a simple nod. The women drew their coats tighter and averted their eyes, uncertain if such kindness could be trusted. The voyage offered ample time for contemplation. The ship's deck carried the scent of rust and brine, of tobacco smoke spiraling into the humid atmosphere. Some women huddled together, softly singing the folk melodies of Bavaria or Saxony, tunes that evoked images of verdant hills and cultivated fields they might never behold again. Others maintained diaries, inscribing in pencil their peculiar sensation of having more sustenance in captivity than they had experienced in months of freedom. A few wept discreetly, contemplating children and parents enduring bombardments back home, wondering if their correspondence would ever reach them, questioning if their families had survived the nocturnal raids upon Hamburg or Dresden. There was no solace in the vast ocean, but there was a steady cadence. Morning ushered in roll calls, the scrape of military boots on steel decks, the sharp commands of American voices. Noon brought sustenance, coffee so potent it burned. Potatoes mashed with butter, meat that seemed extravagant, even when stringy. Night descended, cloaking everything in such profound darkness that the ship appeared solitary in existence. Each passing day eroded the conviction with which these women had once embraced their own nation's narratives. If America was a realm of fiends, why were they eating so well? If the adversary was ruthless, why had no one laid a hand upon them? Nevertheless, a residue of tension never fully dissipated. On one bleak afternoon, a sentry patrolling the deck overheard a nurse's hesitant remark that the bread tasted too exquisite to be genuine, suggesting it might be laced with sedatives. Another woman concurred, positing that they might be weakened first, then compelled into labor until they succumbed. The guard, who possessed a rudimentary command of German, chuckled and assured them they were more secure in their present circumstances than anywhere in Europe. His pronouncements held no sway over them. Fear, once sown, did not wither easily, yet apprehension could not wholly silence the small wonders. A typist hailing from Cologne, accustomed to the dense, dark loaves of rye doled out sparingly back home, nearly wept upon biting into a slice of cornbread for the first time. It crumbled in her fingers, a golden hue with a faint sweetness, utterly dissimilar to the somber, acrid bread of wartime. She secreted half the piece in her coat pocket, savoring it slowly as if it were a precious artifact. Another captive marveled at the seemingly inexhaustible supply of butter, musing aloud how such a nation could provision not only its own soldiers but also its prisoners. This method, her unspoken thought, echoed among most. Germany possessed nothing further. The evenings presented the greatest challenge, not due to any threat from guards or disciplinary measures, but because of recollection. The resonant thrum of the ship's engines through the hull conjured memories of aerial assaults, the identical drone that had heralded bombs descending upon their cities. Some covered their ears, while others offered prayers. In those moments, America remained an abstraction. It was still merely a destination colored by dread. And yet, when they ascended to the deck at dawn and observed gulls wheeling in the distance, when the aroma of bacon wafted from the galley, they could not deny a transformation occurring within them. They were internees, undeniably, but they were internees in a world offering more sustenance than their families had ever known. A young auxiliary named Liesel recorded in her journal one evening that her confinement felt like standing between two portals, one sealing off the ruins of her homeland, the other opening onto an unknown territory. She described the cornbread once more, noting its resemblance to cake, yet consumed with a savory stew, admitting she feared developing a fondness for it. She concealed her journal beneath her cot, apprehensive that even articulating such sentiments might be construed as disloyalty. By the second week, the women spoke less about their impending arrival in America and more about what they had left behind. Letters they carried, folded and creased, recounted tales of scarcity, of fuel shortages, of children enduring cold nights. Some found it impossible to consume their full allocations, wrapping portions of bread in fabric as though they might one day transport them back across the vast ocean. One nurse whispered that her younger brother had not tasted milk in 2 years. Meanwhile, she partook in it each morning without a second thought. The burden of guilt was more profound than the fetters they had envisioned. On the 12th night, the coastline finally materialized, a faint line of lights shimmering against the darkness. America was no longer a mere rumor. It was their tangible, expansive reality, awaiting. The women clustered at the railings, silent, their breath misting in the chill. Some wept anew, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming strangeness of what lay ahead. Behind them, Europe was aflame. Before them, America gleamed with electric light, even in its smallest hamlets. The vessel decelerated as it neared the port, and the scent of land supplanted the sharp tang of the sea. A guard, observing their wide-eyed stares, leaned casually against the railing and remarked, "You'll eat better here than you ever have in your life." The women fixed their gaze upon him, uncomprehending, disinclined to believe, but his words settled among them like embers in dry foliage, too perilous to disregard. As the gangplank descended and Boots prepared to escort them into a nation they had been taught to abhor, a single thought pulsed through the women's hushed anticipation. If even the bread here tasted sweeter than anything in Germany, what else awaited them beyond the barbed wire of America? The train rumbled across the American heartland, conveying its silent contingent of German women further into a world previously known only through propaganda. Through the slatted windows, they observed farmlands stretching in unbroken expanses, fields untouched by artillery fire, barns standing unburnt, children dashing along dirt paths to wave at the passing carriages. This was not the ravaged continent they had departed. It was a territory where the conflict seemed as distant as another world when the train finally shrieked to a halt. The women were marched down wooden platforms into a compound enclosed by towering fences topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers loomed above, their sentries silhouetted against the afternoon sun. For a fleeting instant, it mirrored their deepest fears: enclosures, barriers, and the stern gaze of an enemy in uniform. But then came the secondary shock. The barracks, though utilitarian, were immaculate, Straw-filled mattresses lay neatly arranged on bunks. Stoves radiated warmth, and windows were patched against the cold. The women exchanged weary glances, anticipating the cruelty that was surely to follow. None materialized. Instead, they were guided toward the mess hall, where long tables extended beneath electric lamps, casting a steady, unwavering glow. The room exuded the aroma not of rationed turnip stew or watery cabbage, but of beans simmering in pots, fried meat, and a sweetness they could not readily identify. They lined up, metal trays in hand. Their movements were stiff, the guards beside them observing without comment. When the food was dispensed onto their plates, the sheer abundance nearly overwhelmed them. A generous mound of potatoes glistened with butter. Thin but tangible slices of pork carried the savory notes of salt and fat. Alongside this bounty, a square of bread unlike any they had ever encountered, golden, crumbly, steaming, and subtly sweet. One of the women, the same typist from Cologne who had once questioned the very essence of bread aboard the ship, lifted it between trembling fingers. She broke off a piece, placed it on her tongue, and froze. It was neither rye nor wheat, neither bitter nor sour. It dissolved like warmth itself, leaving a faint trace of sweetness she had not tasted in years. She looked at the guard behind the counter, who merely offered a wry smile and stated, "That's cornbread. Welcome to Texas cornbread." The very word felt foreign, soft upon the tongue. The women sat at the tables, trays before them, and consumed their meal in silence, punctuated only by murmurs of incredulity. The bread was dense, yet tender, its edges slightly rough, sweet as if some baker had secretly incorporated sugar, and when paired with beans and stew, it seemed an impossible delicacy, a fusion of cake and common fare. They exchanged glances, hesitant to voice their shared realization, but the truth impressed itself upon their senses. It was delicious. Days within the camp soon fell into a predictable pattern. Mornings commenced with roll call in the frigid courtyard, the air thick with the collective breath of prisoners standing shoulder to shoulder. Subsequently came work assignments. Some women sewed uniforms, others picked cotton in nearby fields under armed supervision, their hands becoming calloused, but their stomachs no longer aching with emptiness. Farmers occasionally greeted them with reserved curiosity, tossing apples or making light-hearted remarks about German efficiency. Afternoons were dedicated to rest, and evenings led them back to the mess hall, where trays once again brimmed with food that appeared almost too ample for captives. Meatloaf, creamy mashed potatoes, hearty soups, milk, and consistently, in some form, cornbread. It was not a utopia. The fences were real, the barbed wire sharp, and the freedom to venture beyond the compound was non-existent. Guards issued commands. Penalties were imposed upon those who defied them, and the gnawing pang of homesickness afflicted every prisoner. Yet, alongside their apprehension, there existed the persistent, undeniable reality of plenty. In letters surreptitiously passed through censors, the women struggled to articulate their experiences without betraying a sense of guilt. "We are provided more food here than our families back home," one nurse wrote. "It is peculiar. It feels wrong. They offer us milk each morning. Even our children are not drinking milk in Germany at present." She refrained from mentioning the cornbread, though it occupied her thoughts frequently. The sweet, golden slice that she could never adequately describe without sounding like a traitor. The camp itself evolved into a realm of paradoxes. Behind the fences, the women engaged in spirited games of soccer with a ball fashioned from rags, sang hymns in the barracks, and formed vocal ensembles whose harmonies surprised the guards. Some women sketched landscapes from cherished memories. Others diligently taught English to their fellow inmates, intrigued by the unfamiliar language of their captors. Throughout these activities, the meals remained the central focal point of each day. Food was sustenance, certainly, but its significance transcended mere nourishment. It represented a message, subtle yet unmistakable. America was communicating without uttering a word that it possessed the capacity for generosity even towards its adversaries. The cultural divergences occasionally bordered on the comical. One woman inquired of a guard the reason for always serving cornbread with beans, as if the two were intrinsically linked. He responded with laughter, explaining it was the customary preparation in his mother's kitchen. Another prisoner confided to her barrack mates that she had attempted to conceal a slice within her coat, hoarding it as if it were illicit contraband. The bread, however, crumbled into numerous pieces, scattering like golden dust across the floor. She wept softly over the loss, despite having eaten heartily mere moments before. Habits ingrained by hunger and memory proved too deeply etched to be easily erased. Nevertheless, beneath the surface novelty, a current of guilt persisted. News trickled in of continued bombings back home, of families sifting through rubble in search of sustenance, of children fainting in schools due to food deprivation. Within the camp, the prisoners toiled and ate, slept beneath intact roofs, and savored baked goods crafted from cornmeal. The shame of such abundance weighed heavily upon them. Some women penned letters that artfully distorted the truth, claiming they subsisted on meager provisions. They were unwilling to confess to their relatives that their captivity had shielded them from the starvation rampant in their homeland. As the weeks progressed, they began to observe a softening in the guards' demeanor. One corporal shared chewing gum one afternoon, chuckling at their tentative attempts to masticate without swallowing. Another lent a Bible to a nurse who spoke halting English. These fleeting interactions gradually eroded the formidable wall of fear. The women realized they were not being deliberately starved, beaten, or subjected to humiliation. They were being monitored, undeniably, but they were also being tolerated, and even to some extent, respected. And the cornbread, as peculiar as it was, came to symbolize that inherent contradiction, humble, sweet, and profoundly unexpected. Yet, no quantity of food could entirely obliterate the stark reality of the wire enclosure. At night, as powerful floodlights swept across the perimeter, shadows stretched over the barracks like prison bars. Some women lay awake, listening to the distant mournful whistle of trains, their minds conjuring images of escape, of their homes. The ample provisions before them were real, but so too was the absence of liberty. They existed in a state of paradox, caught between gratitude and resentment, between security and profound shame. One evening, as winter winds buffeted the camp's fences, the typist from Cologne sat by her bunk, a slice of cornbread balanced delicately in her palm. She scrutinized it as if it were an ancient relic, torn between her lingering hunger and the weight of memory. She whispered to the woman beside her, "If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they sustain their own people?" The question hung in the dim air, unresolved, unsettling. It was no longer simply about bread. It was about power, about a nation whose wealth seemed boundless, even amidst conflict. The external lights flickered as guards commenced a shift change. The women chewed in silence, the taste of cornbread lingering as both a comfort and a potent reminder. Deep within them, a certainty took root. This simple food carried a significance far beyond the alleviation of hunger. What they had once perceived as malicious intent now revealed itself as something far more disquieting, a kindness that challenged every ingrained belief about their perceived enemy. The night within the camp settled into a peculiar stillness. The low hum of the floodlights, the rhythmic crunch of boots from sentries patrolling the perimeter, and the occasional cough emanating from the barracks served as the sole reminders that the war had not yet concluded. Inside, the women were seated at rudimentary wooden tables, illuminated by the glow of a single overhead bulb, filling thin sheets of paper supplied by the Red Cross. Pencils scratched across the surface as they struggled to find words to bridge the immense chasm between their captivity and their distant homes. What tidings could they possibly convey to their families? What truths could they dare to reveal? A nurse named Hilda gazed at the blank page before her. She could not bring herself to write about the meals, the milk each morning, the potatoes rich with butter, the square of cornbread that had become the quiet, central element of their days. Back home in Hamburg, her younger brother subsisted on watery broth and hard crusts. To speak the truth would feel like an act of betrayal, yet to fabricate, to claim hunger when her stomach was full, seemed equally unbearable. She settled for an oblique approach, describing the weather, the routine of their labor, the simple fact that she was alive. She folded the paper swiftly, as though haste might somehow suppress the guilt that rose in her throat. Around her, others grappled with the same profound dilemma. Their letters served as both a lifeline and a heavy burden. Some women sidestepped the topic of food entirely, dedicating pages to recollections, lullabies, or fervent prayers. Others confessed quietly, almost defiantly, that they had never experienced such ample sustenance. One auxiliary offered a description of the cornbread, unable to resist. "It is golden, like cake, and crumbles in the hand. I do not comprehend why they provide us with such provisions, but I cannot forget its flavor." The censors, meticulously reviewing each letter before its dispatch from the camp, underlined such phrases in red ink. They did not prohibit these words outright, but they meticulously noted them, recognizing the potential message that might travel across the ocean, that America was feeding its adversaries more generously than Germany could sustain its own populace. The irony intensified with each passing meal. In Germany, daily rations for civilians had plummeted below 2,000 calories. Coffee brewed from roasted acorns served as the morning beverage. Meat appeared infrequently, and bread was extended with fillers that rendered it dense and acrid. Women in the camp recalled standing in lengthy queues in their cities, clutching ration cards for cabbage or turnips, often returning home with nothing. Now, confined behind barbed wire, they sat before platters laden with hearty stew, vegetables, milk, and that sweet, yellow bread, which tasted of something beyond mere survival. It was a stark, cruel equation: freedom starved, captivity well-fed. This dissonance gnawed at them. Some women attempted to fast, pushing their trays away, but the primal instinct of hunger invariably prevailed. Others secreted away fragments of food, wrapping them in cloth as if they might one day dispatch them to their families. A few tried to surreptitiously slip morsels into envelopes, though the guards soon apprehended this practice and strictly forbade it. Their longing was not for themselves, but for the families across the sea who would never experience this profusion. One evening in December, a heavy snowfall descended upon the camp, muffling the world in a blanket of white. The women congregated in the barracks, huddling in their coats, and shared stories to ward off the biting cold. A young secretary from Dresden recounted how her father had collapsed from malnutrition, too weak to stand in line for provisions. Another spoke of children scavenging through refuse bins in Berlin for potato peelings. The room fell into a profound silence as they juxtaposed those grim recollections with the untouched plates of food they had left in the mess hall mere hours earlier. No one dared to voice it, but the thought hung palpably in the air. They were being fed better as prisoners than their families were as citizens of the Reich. Yet it was not solely the sustenance that astonished them, it was the entire culture of abundance itself. The Americans spoke casually of chocolate, of fizzy drinks, of chewing gum, items so commonplace here, so exceedingly rare at home. Guards would toss candy bars onto tables with a grin, amused by the women's tentative acceptance. One corporal presented a bottle of Coca-Cola to a nurse, and she clutched it as if it were a precious medicine, gazing at the effervescent liquid with sheer disbelief. She later recorded in her journal that the taste was akin to sweet lightning, something so unnecessary, so extravagantly luxurious, it nearly brought her to tears. The shock of such abundance blurred into a deep sense of shame. Every bite of cornbread was accompanied by the poignant memory of German children who would never taste such sweetness. Every glass of milk served as a stark reminder of ration cards that could purchase nothing. They began to grasp that America's power was not confined to its armaments and soldiery, but resided in the ordinary comforts it could extend even to its captives. This revelation proved more profoundly unsettling than the barbed wire itself. For if a nation could afford to provision its prisoners with such generosity, what did that portend for the eventual outcome of the war? What future could Germany realistically hope for when confronted with such immense capacity? In their letters, this undeniable truth surfaced in scattered fragments. "They inhabit another world," one woman wrote. "Their fields are abundant, their tables laden. Even we who oppose them are never hungry here. I cannot adequately explain it to you, but it is the truth." Another confessed, "We are prisoners, yet we are treated with a degree of fairness. The food is so rich, I find myself unable to consume it all at times. I think of you with every meal." The censors, scrutinizing these words, imagined them vanishing into silence. But some letters did remarkably reach their intended recipients intact. In devastated settlements, mothers would gently unwrap parcels and weep, unable to reconcile the stark image of their children wasting away amidst the debris with the vision of daughters savoring cake-like bread oceans away. The prolonged duration of their confinement intensified the women's understanding that sustenance was never merely a physical necessity. It represented a potent language of authority. Cornbread, in particular, acquired a profound symbolic significance. It was neither wheat nor rye, nor any grain familiar to them. It was quintessentially American, originating from a continent they had been conditioned to dismiss with contempt. Yet now it was placed before them daily. Consuming it felt akin to capitulating in subtle increments, though abstaining was out of the question. Gradually, it became interwoven with their recollections, its flavor inextricably linked to this peculiar internment. One evening, as the guards reduced the illumination and the encampment descended into a restless slumber, Hilda remained awake on her cot. Within her pocket rested a crumpled fragment of cornbread encased in paper. She had brought it from the communal mess hall, reluctant to consume it entirely, equally unwilling to relinquish it. Her thoughts drifted to her brother's gaunt visage, to her mother's quivering hands, to the shattered avenues of Hamburg. Then, her mind turned to the laden tray presented to her mere hours prior, piled high with provisions she could barely manage to touch. She bit into the morsel, tears welling, the sweetness almost overwhelming. The following morning, during the head count, she murmured to the woman beside her, "If they provide for us in this manner, perhaps their intention is to transform us." The words escaped before she could intercept them. The other woman offered no reply, but her silence conveyed not dissent, but apprehension. Fear of the implications should benevolence itself be the instrument of persuasion America had chosen. The arrival of spring in 1946 heralded an unsettling quietude, a world suspended between conflicts. For the German women who had endured months behind American barriers, the day of their liberation dawned unobtrusively, marked by pronouncements read aloud and the presence of waiting railway carriages. They gathered their scant possessions, letters, torn fragments of photographs, diaries half filled with confessions and hesitations, and marched forth beneath the same watchtowers that had once instilled them with dread. This time, the sentries did not scowl. Some even offered a gesture of farewell. The women boarded the trains, the fences receding into the distance, and the land of plenty flowed past like a fading dream that already seemed improbable. The return voyage differed considerably from their initial crossing. There was no thick, bean-laden soup, no platters of golden loaves. Instead, the Atlantic returned them with provisions that evoked their homeland, somber, unyielding, functional. They disembarked in ports where smoldering ruins punctuated the landscape and destitution loomed at every turn. As the ship's doors opened, they stepped into what had once been cities, now reduced to mere shells. Skeletal structures of stone-lined streets choked with debris, the air acrid with the scent of ash. Mothers embraced daughters with trembling arms. Children clung to sisters repatriated from captivity. Yet, this reunion was incomplete, marred by the absence of those who had not survived. Hilda, who had once guarded a piece of cornbread in her pocket as if it were a precious artifact, discovered her home in Hamburg reduced to crumbling walls. Her younger brother had succumbed during the final winter, his system unable to withstand the prolonged period of inadequate nourishment. Her mother's countenance was etched with sorrow, her hair nearly bleached white by grief and privation. Hilda embraced her, tears flowing, a profound sense of guilt piercing her more acutely than any physical blow. She yearned to speak of the sustenance she had consumed during her internment, of the unexpected leniency from their adversaries, of the sweet flavor of bread derived from corn. However, the words remained trapped. To speak the truth would have been an act of profound unkindness. Thus, she resorted to silence. Or, more accurately, she remained reticent. Nevertheless, the memories persisted through the subsequent years as Germany grappled with the lean periods of 1946 and 1947. While potatoes froze in the frozen earth and children foraged for discarded coal along the railway lines, these women carried within them the taste of something unforgettable. Cornbread evolved in their minds from mere sustenance to a potent emblem of their bewildering internment. The enemy's prosperity stood in stark contrast to their nation's devastation. Some confided in trusted friends, recounting America as a place so extraordinary that even its prisoners dined like royalty. Others kept the recollection guarded, fearing resentment or disbelief. Over time, accounts began to surface, appearing in letters and oral histories recorded decades later when the pang of guilt had diminished. A nurse recalled that her initial slice of cornbread had felt as though she were consuming the bounty of an entire continent. Another confessed that it haunted her, symbolizing the shame of prospering more in defeat than in fidelity. A third, years later, chuckled bitterly, admitting she had never acquired a fondness for its taste. It was excessively sweet, overly dense. Yet, she conceded that she could never forget it, as it served as a reminder of the day she realized Germany had irrevocably lost. The cornbread became a mnemonic shorthand. It was mentioned in the same breath as Coca-Cola, with chewing gum, with the initial sight of American cigarettes bartered with local farmers for their children and grandchildren. These narratives sounded almost fantastical. How could captivity have been imbued with sweetness? How could an adversary have provided what their own homeland could not? For the women who experienced it, the inherent contradiction was deeply ingrained. Years later, Hilda herself, now a grandmother, stood in her kitchen within a re-established Hamburg. She stirred cornmeal into a bowl, a rarity in German markets, yet obtainable following the influx of American aid provided through the Marshall Plan. She baked a pan of cornbread, its golden hue and steamy aroma filling the modest dwelling. Her grandchildren inquired about its identity, and she responded with a faint smile. "I first encountered this when I was a detainee." Their eyes widened, anticipating a narrative of bitterness or anger, but she simply shook her head gently. It was peculiar. It was an act of compassion. I have never forgotten it. Such was the enduring power of the recollection. It was not that the cornbread itself possessed any inherent extraordinary qualities. It was simple, unpretentious, born of necessity in a land that had experienced hardship, but never on the scale of starvation faced by Germany. What rendered it unforgettable was its imbued meaning. It revealed to the internees a truth far more disquieting than any propaganda, that America's might resided not solely in its armaments, but in its capacity to sustain even those it had vanquished. It was a subtle form of triumph, inscribed not in pronouncements or treaties, but within kitchens and mess halls, on trays presented to women who had anticipated cruelty and instead discovered sweetness. The internal conflict that plagued them was not merely between nations, but between memory and allegiance. To acknowledge that their confinement had provided them with sustenance meant admitting that their adversaries had demonstrated greater generosity than their own leaders. It meant confessing that kindness had emanated not from the Reich, but from those they had been taught to perceive as monsters. The cornbread compelled them to confront a reality that would accompany them throughout their lives. that humanity could, at times, manifest in the guise of the adversary, and that abundance itself could be a weapon as formidable as any firearm. For scholars, these accounts offer more than mere anecdotes. They illuminate the peculiar theater of conflict, where perception crumbles under the weight of experience, and propaganda collapses against tangible reality. For the women who lived through it, the experience was more profound, more personal. Each mouthful of cornbread represented both solace and indictment, a stark reminder that survival could sometimes arrive cloaked in irony. The memory endured across decades, persisting through ruin, reconstruction, and enforced silence. In interviews conducted during the 1980s and 1990s, elderly women chuckled with a hint of embarrassment as they recounted their initial encounters with American cuisine. One woman shared that she had preserved the recipe throughout her life, though she rarely prepared it. Another confessed that the scent of sweet bread invariably transported her back to a barbaric time, to a tray, to the precise moment she grasped that the war had truly concluded. Cornbread was never merely bread. It was the aroma of prosperity emanating from an internment camp intended to break them. It was the flavor of irony on the tongues of prisoners who had anticipated shackles and instead encountered butter. It was the emblem of a power that nourished rather than deprived, that offered sweetness where bitterness was expected. For German women who navigated the tumultuous seas of defeat, it became an indelible detail, and decades later, as they presented it to their grandchildren on rustic tables within their rebuilt residences, the taste still carried its dual significance: sweetness and shame, memory and revelation. For them, cornbread was not simply food. It was an unspoken yet unavoidable question, resonating across generations. If compassion could emerge from captivity, what else might the experience of loss imply?